The hospital discharge papers crinkled in my pocket as the taxi pulled up to my Victorian home. 21 days felt like an eternity. Complications from my hip replacement had kept me fighting infection and fever while the world continued spinning without me. I was exhausted but relieved to finally be home. Home. The two-story house William and I had lovingly restored over our 30 years of marriage stood before me, bathed in late afternoon light. Roses I'd planted decades ago still bloomed along the walkway, though they needed tending after my absence. "Need help with your bags, ma'am?" the driver asked, eyeing my walking cane. "Just to the door, please," I replied, my voice still raspy from the hospital's dry air. My son should be waiting. The front door opened before we reached it. Stephen, my only child, stood in the doorway, not with the welcoming smile I expected, but with an expression I'd never seen before, cold, distant, resolute. "Mom." His voice matched his face, detached, formal. Behind him, I glimpsed movement in my living room. His wife, Jessica. And were those her parents? "Stephen, what's going on?" I asked, stepping forward. He blocked the entrance, not moving aside. "You shouldn't have come here. We weren't expecting you until tomorrow." The taxi driver set my small suitcase beside me, sensing the tension. I paid him quickly, suddenly wishing he wouldn't leave. "There's no easy way to say this," Stephen continued as the taxi pulled away. "Things have changed while you were hospitalized. The house isn't yours anymore." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with my recovering body. "What are you talking about?" "We've made arrangements. Jessica's parents needed to relocate from Seattle, and this house has way more space than you need. The paperwork's been signed. You'll need to find another living situation." My mind struggled to process his words. "Paperwork? What paperwork? I'd signed nothing." "Stephen, this is ridiculous. Let me inside my home right now." I stepped forward again, leaning heavily on my cane. This time, Jessica appeared beside him, her blonde hair perfectly styled, wearing what I recognized as my own emerald earrings, William's gift for our 25th anniversary. "Martha," she said, with that false sweetness I'd grown to recognize over the years, "we've packed your personal items. They're in boxes in the garage. We can have them delivered wherever you're staying." From behind them emerged Jessica's parents, Howard and Patricia Thompson. I'd met them only a handful of times over the years. Howard, tall and distinguished with silver hair, had always struck me as arrogant. Patricia, with her perpetual judgmental expression, had never bothered to hide her disdain for my quaint home, the same home she now stood in as if she owned it. "I'm sorry it came to this," Howard offered without sounding sorry at all. "But Stephen made the arrangements quite clear. The house has been transferred legally." "Legally?" I sputtered. "That's impossible." "I never signed anything." Stephen's face hardened. "Power of attorney. Remember that paperwork you signed before your surgery? For medical decisions? It covered financial matters, too." The realization hit me like a physical blow. I had signed paperwork, a stack of documents my own son had presented while I was anxious about my upcoming surgery. I'd trusted him completely, hadn't even read beyond the first page. "You tricked me." The words felt hollow, inadequate for the magnitude of this betrayal. "We're doing what's best for everyone," Jessica interjected. "This house is too much for you to maintain alone. Stephen's been managing it for years anyway." "Don't appear here again," Stephen said firmly. "We'll have your things delivered. The decision is final." I stood there, leaning on my cane, staring at the son I'd raised, the little boy I'd read bedtime stories to, the teenager I'd taught to drive, the man whose college education I'd paid for by working overtime, now a stranger wearing my son's face. "This is illegal," I said quietly, "and you know it." "It's done," he replied coldly. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Something broke inside me then, but not in the way they expected, not into tears or pleading. Instead, a cold clarity washed over me, a crystallizing of purpose I hadn't felt since my days overseeing banking compliance. "Enjoy it then," I said simply, turning away. "Enjoy it all." The confusion on their faces at my calm departure was almost worth the devastation. Almost. As I limped back to the waiting taxi I'd wisely asked to wait, I pulled out my phone. Not to call the police. Not yet. That would come later, in my own time, on my own terms. Instead, I texted a single message to Diane Anderson. Plan B. Now. After 21 days fighting for my life in the hospital, I returned home to find my own son had betrayed me in the most unimaginable way. With my walking cane still supporting my weakened body, I faced the cruel reality that he and his wife had given my beloved home to her parents. What they don't realize is that my calm "enjoy it" wasn't surrender. It was the beginning of my counterattack. The downtown Portland hotel room was impersonal, but clean, a temporary refuge while I gathered my strength and my wits. My hands still trembled as I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my phone. Diane had responded immediately. On it. Stay safe. Coming to you. Diane Anderson and I had been friends for 40 years, since our college days. She'd become a formidable attorney while I'd built my career in banking compliance. After William died, she'd helped me organize my affairs with a thoroughness born of our shared professional paranoia. Always have a backup plan, she'd advised, especially with family money. At the time, I thought she was being overly cautious. Now her foresight seemed almost prophetic. A soft knock at the door announced her arrival. Despite the late hour, Diane looked perfectly put together in her tailored suit, silver-streaked hair pulled back in her trademark bun. Her expression, however, was pure fury. "Those absolute vultures!" she hissed, pulling me into a careful hug, mindful of my still healing body. "Are you all right? Physically or emotionally?" I attempted a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. "Both." She set her briefcase on the desk and began unpacking files with practiced efficiency. "I'm standing, which is something. The rest," I sank back onto the bed. "I keep thinking I'll wake up, and this will be some infection-induced nightmare." Diane's expression softened momentarily before her professional mask returned. "I've already started the process. The trust documentation is ironclad. William was nothing if not meticulous. The house transfer won't stand up to legal scrutiny." "How long?" I asked. "To invalidate their fraudulent transfer?" "A few weeks, maybe months if they fight dirty." She paused. "But Martha, there's something else. Something I found while reviewing your accounts." My stomach tightened. "What is it?" "Unusual withdrawals from your investment accounts during your hospitalization. Large ones." She handed me a printed statement. I scanned the document, my banking experience immediately spotting the irregularities. 5 transfers totaling over $220,000, all to accounts I didn't recognize, all executed with digital signatures that supposedly came from me while I was barely conscious in the ICU. "They didn't just take my house," I whispered, the full scope of the betrayal washing over me. "They've been draining my accounts." "It gets worse," Diane continued grimly. "I had my paralegal do some preliminary digging into the Thompsons. Their property consulting business in Seattle has multiple complaints filed against it, all mysteriously dropped before formal investigation. And Jessica's LinkedIn profile lists experience at 3 mortgage companies that have since been shut down for regulatory violations." The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. "They're running some kind of property fraud scheme." Diane nodded. "And they've probably been planning this for months, waiting for the right opportunity. Your hospitalization just gave them the perfect chance to accelerate their timeline." My mind flashed back to conversations over the past year. Jessica's increasing interest in my financial affairs, Stephen's casual questions about my banking history and connections. The foundation of this betrayal had been laid long before my surgery. "Stephen," I said, his name catching in my throat, "do you think he knows about whatever they're doing?" Diane's silence was answer enough. "I taught him better than this," I said, my voice barely audible. "His father taught him better. People change, Martha, especially when money's involved." Diane's tone was gentle but firm. "The question now is, what do you want to do about it?" I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of 67 years, of building a career, a family, a home, pressing down on me. When I opened them again, something had hardened inside me. "Everything," I said. "I want to do everything possible to get back what's mine and make them face consequences for what they've done. All of them, even Stephen." Diane's eyebrow raised slightly. "No maternal protection clause?" He made his choice. The words hurt to say, but they were true. If he's involved in something illegal, he deserves whatever comes from it. She nodded, satisfied with my resolve. "Then we'll need to be smart about this. Strategic. I have some contacts at the Financial Crimes Division who would be very interested in what we found." "I have some contacts too," I replied, thinking of my former colleagues. "But I don't want to move too quickly. They believe I'm defeated, a helpless old woman who'll slink away in shame. That perception gives us an advantage. What are you thinking?" I reached for my purse and pulled out a small black notebook. my lifeline during my banking days. First, we document everything. Every withdrawal, every document they forged, every lie they've told. Then we start following the money trail. If they're running a fraud operation, there will be patterns. Diane smiled, the sharp, predatory smile I remembered from our younger days. And then, I said, feeling a surge of cold determination, we spring the trap when they least expect it. As we began outlining our plan, my phone chimed with a text from Stephen. Mom, we need the passwords to your investment accounts to transfer your remaining funds for your care. Send them ASAP. I showed the message to Diane, who shook her head in disgust. What should I reply? I asked. Nothing yet. Let them wonder. Let them worry. I nodded, setting the phone aside. The old Martha might have responded immediately, eager to smooth things over, to maintain peace at any cost, but that Martha had been left behind at the threshold of my stolen home. This Martha was playing a longer game. Retreating to a hotel room, I'm reunited with my oldest friend and attorney, Diane, who reveals shocking news. Not only did they steal my house, but they've been draining my accounts while I was hospitalized. As we uncover suspicious patterns in the Thompsons' business history, I face the heartbreaking realization that my own son might be complicit in something truly sinister. Still healing physically, but growing stronger in resolve, I make a crucial decision. Instead of confronting them immediately, I'll let them believe they've defeated me while I quietly build the case that will become their undoing. You need to see this, Diane said, sliding her laptop across the hotel room's desk. 3 days had passed since my unceremonious eviction. We'd relocated to a more comfortable extended stay suite, using cash to avoid creating electronic trails. My physical strength was returning gradually, though the emotional wounds remained raw. The screen showed property records from my neighborhood. I squinted, scanning the document. Third property from the bottom, Diane directed. My eyes widened as I spotted it. The Wilson family 2 doors down had sold their home 3 months ago. The buyers, Thompson Investment Properties LLC. That can't be a coincidence, I murmured. It gets better. Diane clicked through several more documents. The Hendersons across the street sold to the same LLC last month, and the retired couple on the corner. Their house is now under contract with the same buyer. They're buying up the neighborhood, I whispered, the scheme becoming clearer. But why? Diane pulled up a zoning application filed with the city planning department. This was submitted 2 weeks ago, while you were still in the hospital. It's a proposal to rezone the entire block from single-family residential to mixed-use commercial. The implications hit me like a physical blow. My neighborhood sat just outside Portland's rapidly developing Pearl District. With commercial zoning, the property values would skyrocket. They're using my house as headquarters while they acquire the surrounding properties, I said, the pieces falling into place. Once they control enough of the block to force the rezoning, the property values triple. At minimum, Diane finished. Based on current market rates, we're talking a potential profit of 15 to 20 million. My banking experience let me immediately grasp the magnitude of the scheme. But they'd need significant capital for the initial purchases. Where's that coming from? Diane's expression darkened. That's where it gets concerning. I had my investigator friend pull some records. The Thompsons have a pattern in Seattle. They identify vulnerable property owners, primarily elderly or those facing financial hardship, then use predatory lending practices to gain control of their properties. Mortgage fraud, I said, the term familiar from my banking days. Exactly. They offer refinancing deals that seem too good to be true, use falsified appraisals to manipulate property values, then structure the loans to inevitably fail. When the owners default, they swoop in and acquire the properties at a fraction of their worth. I thought of my neighbors, many of them aging, living on fixed incomes in homes they'd owned for decades. Perfect targets. And my accounts? The money they've been transferring? Initial capital, most likely. They need funds to make the first purchases and cover expenses until the scheme pays off. Your investment portfolio was a convenient source. The calculated cruelty of it made my breath catch. Not just taking my home and money, but using them to victimize my entire community. People who'd attended William's funeral, who'd brought me meals when I was first widowed. What about Stephen? I asked, voicing the question that had been haunting me. How involved is he? Diane hesitated before opening another file. This was recorded 3 weeks ago at Seattle First National Bank. The security camera footage showed Stephen and Jessica entering the bank together, then meeting with a loan officer. The timestamp showed it was 2 days after my surgery, while I was heavily sedated in the ICU. They used the power of attorney to access my safe deposit box, I realized, recognizing the bank where I kept important documents. Yes, and according to the access log, they removed several items, including your original property deed and the trust documents. I closed my eyes, momentarily overwhelmed. My own son. The little boy who'd once insisted on absolute fairness when playing board games, who'd returned a wallet he'd found with $50 inside. How had he become this person? "There's one more thing you should see," Diane said gently, pulling up an email chain. This was forwarded to me by one of my contacts at the SEC. They've had the Thompsons on their radar for some time. The emails were between Jessica and her father, dating back nearly 8 months. They discussed their plans in thinly veiled language, identifying target properties in my neighborhood, assessing which homeowners might be vulnerable to their schemes, and most disturbingly, specifically mentioning my house as their operational center once they secured access. One line in particular made my blood run cold. S, still hesitant, but coming around. Says mother unlikely to recover fully from planned surgery. Timeline accelerated. Planned surgery, I repeated, the words barely audible. My hip replacement wasn't emergency surgery. It was scheduled months in advance. Martha. Diane's voice held a warning, as if trying to prepare me for a blow. They were waiting for this, I continued, the horrible truth dawning. They knew I'd be vulnerable after surgery. They were counting on it. We don't know that Stephen understood the full extent. Stop. I held up my hand, unable to bear any more excuses for my son. He knew enough. He knew they wanted my house, my money. He knew they were planning something while I was incapacitated. The pain of this realization was sharper than any surgical incision. My own child had not only betrayed me, but had done so with calculation and foresight. I stood up, ignoring the protest from my healing hip, and moved to the window. Portland's skyline glittered in the evening light, indifferent to my small human tragedy playing out in its midst. "What do you want to do?" Diane asked quietly. I turned back to her, my decision crystallizing with perfect clarity. "I want justice," I said simply. "Not just for me, but for everyone they've targeted or plan to target. And I want my house back." Diane nodded, her expression grave but determined. "Then we'll need to move carefully. They think they've won. That gives us the element of surprise." "Good," I replied, a plan already forming in my mind, because I'm about to give them the surprise of their lives. As I examine property records with Diane, a disturbing pattern emerges. The Thompsons have been systematically purchasing homes throughout my neighborhood, planning a massive rezoning scheme worth millions. The betrayal cuts deeper when I discover evidence that Stephen wasn't just an opportunistic participant. He knew about their plans months ago, possibly even timing their takeover around my scheduled surgery. With my neighborhood and former neighbors now at risk from their predatory scheme, my resolve hardens. This isn't just about reclaiming my house anymore. It's about stopping a sophisticated fraud operation before more vulnerable people become victims. And I'm precisely the person who knows how to do it. "Martha, are you sure about this?" Diane's voice carried concern as she watched me apply makeup in the hotel bathroom mirror. "Your hip is still healing." "I spent 21 days in that hospital bed feeling helpless," I replied, carefully applying lipstick with a steady hand. "I'm done with helplessness." 1 week had passed since my eviction. In that time, Diane and I had built a comprehensive understanding of the Thompsons' operation. Their Seattle business had left a trail of financial victims, elderly homeowners who'd lost everything to predatory contracts and falsified documents. Now they were replicating the same scheme in Portland, with my house as their base of operations. "The timing has to be perfect," I reminded her, checking my appearance one final time. The elegant gray pantsuit and subtle jewelry projected exactly the image I wanted. Not a defeated elderly woman, but the seasoned banking professional I'd been for decades. "Agents Reeves and Callahan are standing by," Diane confirmed. "They'll only move when we give the signal." After discovering the extent of the fraud operation, we'd taken our evidence to the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. The agents had been building a case against the Thompsons for months, but lacked the insider access we now provided. We'd struck a deal. They would hold off on immediate arrests to allow us to gather more concrete evidence, and in exchange, I would get priority consideration in recovering my assets. Remember, We need documented proof that they're using my identity and financial information, I said, reciting the key points of our strategy. Bank access, forged signatures, explicit acknowledgement of the scheme. Without those, they could claim I voluntarily transferred everything. Diane nodded, checking her watch. Jessica's weekly salon appointment starts in 30 minutes. She'll be gone for at least 2 hours. Howard and Patricia are at a real estate showing across town. And Stephen? At work until 5, according to his calendar. Perfect. My son's predictable schedule, something I'd once found endearing, was now a tactical advantage. I took a deep breath, centering myself. Let's go. The taxi dropped me 2 blocks from my house. I walked slowly, using my cane more for the appearance of frailty than actual support. The neighborhood looked the same as always. Manicured lawns, historic homes, the giant oak tree at the corner where Stephen had once built a treehouse. Yet everything felt different, tainted by the knowledge of what was happening beneath the surface. As I approached my house, I noticed subtle changes. The roses I'd tended for years had been removed, replaced with generic landscaping. The porch furniture William and I had restored together was gone. The transformation had already begun, erasing our family's imprint. I didn't approach the front door. Instead, I walked around to the side entrance, the one leading to the kitchen that, in my hurry to leave for the hospital, I'd forgotten to lock. It had been our family's secret for years. Stephen used it as a teenager to sneak in past curfew, thinking I never knew. The key turned smoothly in the lock. I stepped inside quietly, hearing unfamiliar voices from my study. Following the sound, I paused outside the partially open door. The Wilson closing is scheduled for Friday, said a male voice I recognized as Howard Thompson. Once that's complete, we'll control 40% of the block. What about the Henderson property? Another voice, unfamiliar, probably their associate. Already done. We used the Wilson woman's banking credentials to secure the financing, clean as a whistle. My hand tightened around my cane. They were using my banking reputation and credentials to facilitate their frauds, exactly what we needed to prove. I activated the recording app on my phone before pushing the door open. The scene froze like a tableau. Howard Thompson sitting behind William's antique desk, his associate standing by the window, both staring at me in naked shock. "Hello, Howard," I said calmly. "Discussing business in my study?" "Martha," he recovered quickly, standing. "This is unexpected. How did you get in?" "Through the door," I replied simply. "The one to the house that still legally belongs to me." His associate, a nervous-looking man in his 30s, glanced between us. "Should I come back later, Mr. Thompson?" "No need," I said before Howard could respond. "I'm just collecting some personal papers I need." Howard's expression hardened. "This property no longer belongs to you." Stephen was quite clear about that. Yes, he was, I agreed, moving toward the filing cabinet in the corner. Very clear about his intentions, just as you've been clear about yours, using my banking credentials for your financing arrangements. The color drained from Howard's face. "I don't know what you're talking about, don't you?" I opened the cabinet drawer, extracting a folder. "The Henderson property? Using my credentials to secure funding? I just heard you discussing it." The associate backed toward the door. "Mr. Thompson, I should really go." "Martha is confused," Howard said sharply. "Her recent hospitalization has affected her mental state. Isn't that right, Martha?" I smiled thinly, closing the drawer. "My mental state is perfectly clear. Clear enough to understand exactly what you, Patricia, and Jessica are doing. Clear enough to wonder if my son fully comprehends the legal implications of the fraud he's facilitating." Howard's face transformed, the mask of concern dropping to reveal calculated menace. "You have no proof of anything, and even if you did, no one would believe you over your own son. Now get out before I call the police and have you removed for trespassing." I nodded, as if considering his words. "You're right about one thing, Howard. Proof is essential." I held up my phone, the recording app clearly visible. "That's why I made sure to get some." His eyes widened, fury replacing shock. "Give me that phone." "I don't think so." I backed toward the door, my heart racing despite my outward calm. "I have what I came for. Enjoy the house while you can." As I turned to leave, Howard lunged forward, grabbing my arm with bruising force. "You're not going anywhere with that recording." I hadn't anticipated physical confrontation. Pain shot through my still-healing hip as I struggled to maintain balance. "Let go of me," I demanded, raising my voice deliberately. "Give me the phone first," he snarled, reaching for it with his free hand. In that moment, the front door burst open. "FBI! Hands where we can see them!" Agents Reeves and Callahan rushed in, weapons drawn. Howard froze, then slowly released my arm, raising his hands. Our contingency plan, triggered by a panic button app on my phone, had worked perfectly. "Martha Wilson?" Agent Reeves approached me while her partner secured Howard. "Are you all right?" "Yes," I said, steadying myself against the doorframe. "And I believe I have something you'll find very interesting." Taking a calculated risk, I returned to my house while Jessica is away, using a forgotten side entrance to catch Howard Thompson in the act of discussing their fraudulent activities. When confronted, his initial shock turns to threatening behavior that forces our FBI contacts to intervene earlier than planned. Despite the confrontation turning physical, I've secured the evidence we need. A recording of Howard explicitly acknowledging the use of my banking credentials in their scheme. As he's taken into custody, I realize this is only the beginning of dismantling their operation. The real test will come when my son discovers what's happening, and that his mother is the architect of the Thompsons' downfall. The FBI field office was clinically impersonal. Beige walls, utilitarian furniture, the faint smell of coffee and paper. I sat in an interview room, my hip aching despite the extra-strength pain reliever Agent Reeves had offered me. "Mrs. Wilson, your recording is extremely valuable," Agent Callahan said, closing his notebook. "Combined with the financial documentation you and Ms. Anderson provided, we have enough to secure warrants for all the Thompson properties and business records." "What about my house?" I asked. "My accounts?" "A judge has already issued an emergency injunction freezing all transactions related to your property," he assured me. "No one can sell it or transfer it further until ownership is legally clarified." Relief washed through me, but it was tempered by the knowledge that this was just the beginning. The Thompsons had been taken into custody, but Stephen and Jessica remained unaware of what had transpired. "What happens next?" I asked. "We'll execute search warrants at your residence this evening," Reeves explained. "Mrs. Thompson will be detained for questioning. As for your son?" She hesitated, her professional demeanor softening slightly. "Given your statements, we'll need to determine his level of involvement." The door opened, and Diane entered, her expression grim but satisfied. "The first round of warrants just came through. They're moving on the Thompson offices in Seattle simultaneously." "Mrs. Wilson," Callahan said carefully, "we understand this is difficult. If you prefer not to be present when we execute the warrant at your home—" "I'll be there," I interrupted firmly. "This is my house. I want to see this through." 3 hours later, I sat in an unmarked FBI vehicle across the street from my home. The afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows across the lawn where Stephen had once played as a child. Jessica's car was in the driveway. She had returned from her salon appointment, blissfully unaware that her father was currently being processed at the federal detention center. "They're in position," Reeves said quietly from the driver's seat, listening to updates through her earpiece. "Mrs. Thompson Wilson is confirmed inside, along with your son. He arrived home early." My heart tightened. Stephen wasn't supposed to be home yet. I'd hoped to spare him the public spectacle of what was about to happen, had even arranged for him to be approached separately at his office. Now he would experience the full force of the raid alongside his wife. "Are you sure you want to witness this?" Diane asked from beside me, her hand covering mine. Before I could answer, a convoy of vehicles turned onto the street, 3 unmarked sedans and a large tactical van. They stopped in front of my house, and agents emerged in coordinated movements, some wearing the distinctive FBI windbreakers. "Federal agents! We have a warrant!" The words carried clearly across the quiet neighborhood as they approached the front door. I couldn't hear the response from inside, but the door opened after a moment. From my vantage point, I could see Jessica standing in the doorway, her expression transitioning from confusion to shock. Behind her, Stephen appeared, moving to stand protectively beside his wife. "It's time," Reeves said, opening her door. "Stay behind us, please." As we crossed the street, neighbors emerged from surrounding houses, drawn by the commotion. I felt their stares, curious, concerned, some perhaps gleefully scandalized by the drama unfolding. Jessica was the first to spot me approaching behind the agents, her carefully maintained composure shattered. "You!" she spat, her voice rising hysterically. "You did this?" Stephen's eyes found mine, his expression shifting from confusion to dawning horror as he realized I was with the federal agents, not being brought in for questioning like them. "Mom?" His voice cracked slightly. "What's happening?" "Your mother has provided evidence of extensive financial fraud being perpetrated by the Thompson family," Agent Callahan stated formally. "We have a warrant to search these premises and seize all relevant documents and electronic devices." "Fraud?" Stephen repeated, looking genuinely confused. "What fraud? This is ridiculous." "Is it?" I stepped forward, my cane tapping rhythmically against the walkway. "Howard was quite explicit about using my banking credentials to secure fraudulent financing this morning. In my study, in my house." Jessica's face drained of color. "You were here? How did you—" "The side door," I replied simply. "Some things you never bothered to learn about this house, Jessica. Like the fact that it legally belongs to a trust established by my late husband, which can't be transferred without the signatures of all trustees, including Diane, who certainly never signed anything." Stephen looked between his wife and me, his expression increasingly desperate. "Mom, there's been a misunderstanding. We were trying to help you by stealing my house, draining my accounts, setting up your in-laws to run their property scheme using my financial reputation." My voice remained steady, despite the emotion churning beneath. "That's not help, Stephen. That's fraud. That's theft." "Mrs. Thompson-Wilson, we need you to come with us for questioning," Reeves interjected, gesturing toward one of the vehicles. Jessica's shock gave way to calculated composure. "I want my attorney present. I'm not saying anything without representation." "That's your right," Callahan acknowledged before turning to Stephen. "Mr. Wilson, we'll need to speak with you as well." "I don't understand," Stephen said, his voice hollow. "Mom, what have you done?" The question, so fundamentally backward, so revealing of his inability to recognize his own culpability, struck me like a physical blow. "What have I done?" I repeated, meeting his gaze directly. "I've protected myself and others from people who believe they can take whatever they want without consequences. I taught you better than this, Stephen. Your father taught you better." As agents began leading Jessica toward a waiting vehicle, she turned back with unexpected venom. "You think you've won? You have no idea what you're dealing with when my father's attorneys get involved. Your father is already in custody," I interrupted calmly, "as is your mother. The FBI is currently searching your offices in Seattle. It's over, Jessica." Her face contorted with rage as agents guided her firmly to the car. Stephen remained on the porch, watching with stunned disbelief as other agents entered our home, carrying evidence collection equipment. "Mom," he said quietly as I turned to follow Diane back to our vehicle. "I didn't know everything they were planning. You have to believe me." I paused, studying the face of the child I'd raised, searching for the truth in his eyes. "Maybe you didn't know everything," I conceded. "But you knew enough, Stephen, and you chose them over me anyway." As I walked away, I heard him call after me, his voice breaking. "Where am I supposed to go now?" I didn't turn back. The question echoed the one I'd faced when he'd evicted me from my own home. The symmetry wasn't lost on me, but unlike my son, I found no satisfaction in his distress, only a profound sadness for what we'd both lost. Some betrayals, I was learning, leave wounds too deep for simple forgiveness. As FBI agents raid my home, arresting Jessica and questioning Stephen, I watch from across the street, torn between vindication and heartbreak. The confusion on my son's face when he realizes I orchestrated their downfall quickly turns to desperate denial as he claims ignorance of their scheme. Jessica's mask of composure finally shatters, revealing the calculating criminal beneath, while part of me aches at Stephen's plaintive question, "Where am I supposed to go now?" I recognize the poetic justice. He's experiencing exactly what he inflicted on me. Some lessons come at terrible cost, but as I walk away from the home I'll soon reclaim, I know this confrontation was just the first step in a longer journey toward justice, and, perhaps someday, healing. "You should eat something, Martha." Diane pushed a container of soup toward me across the hotel room desk that had become our makeshift office. 3 days had passed since the FBI raid. 3 days of statements, evidence reviews, and legal proceedings that left little time for processing the emotional aftermath of what had happened. "I'm not hungry," I replied, sorting through the latest batch of documents Diane had brought from her office. "You haven't been hungry for days," she persisted. "Your body is still healing. You need strength." I sighed, knowing she was right. The stress and physical strain had taken their toll. Reluctantly, I opened the container and took a spoonful of the chicken soup. Better. Diane nodded, satisfied. Now, we should discuss the meeting tomorrow. The meeting she referred to was my first face-to-face conversation with Stephen since the raid. He had requested it through his attorney, a young public defender named Marcus Reed, who had contacted Diane yesterday. He claims he didn't understand the extent of the Thompsons' operation, Diane continued, her tone neutral. Says Jessica kept him in the dark about most of it. And the power of attorney he tricked me into signing? The transfers from my accounts? I couldn't keep the bitterness from my voice. Was he in the dark about those too? Diane's expression softened. I'm not defending him, Martha. I'm just relaying what his attorney said. I set down the soup spoon, my appetite gone again. What else did this Mr. Reed say? Stephen wants to cooperate fully with the investigation. He's offered to provide complete testimony about Jessica and her parents in exchange for consideration in his own case. He's turning on them. The realization shouldn't have surprised me, yet somehow it did. The Stephen I thought I knew had always been loyal to a fault. Self-preservation, Diane suggested. The evidence against the Thompsons is overwhelming. He's making the smart legal move. And what does he want from me? I asked, though I suspected I already knew. Officially? Nothing. The meeting is supposedly just to explain his side of things. Diane's skeptical tone made it clear she didn't believe this was the full story. Unofficially? My guess is he's hoping you'll speak to the prosecutors on his behalf. A mother's plea for leniency could carry significant weight. I closed my eyes, suddenly exhausted beyond measure. The thought of facing Stephen, of hearing his explanations and excuses, made my chest tighten painfully. You don't have to meet with him, Diane reminded me gently. You owe him nothing at this point. I know, I said, but I need answers, Diane. I need to understand how my son became someone who could do this. The federal building's interview room was austere. A metal table, uncomfortable chairs, and a large mirror that undoubtedly concealed an observation room. I sat with Diane beside me, hands folded on the table to hide their slight tremor. When the door opened, I barely recognized the man who entered. Stephen, my confident, always put-together son, looked haggard. His usual business attire had been replaced by rumpled khakis and a plain button-down shirt. The shadowed stubble on his face suggested he hadn't shaved in days. "Mom," he said, his voice hoarse as he took the seat across from me. His attorney, a serious-looking young man with wire-rimmed glasses, sat beside him. "Stephen," I acknowledged, working to keep my voice steady. An uncomfortable silence stretched between us, neither quite knowing how to begin this impossible conversation. "Mrs. Wilson," Marcus Reed finally spoke, "my client has requested this meeting to explain certain aspects of the situation that he believes have been misunderstood." "I'm listening," I said, my eyes fixed on Stephen rather than his attorney. Stephen cleared his throat. "First, I want you to know that I never intended for things to go this far. When Jessica and I first discussed having her parents move to Portland, it was supposed to be temporary, just until they found their own place." "And the power of attorney?" I prompted when he paused. "The one you tricked me into signing before my surgery?" He had the grace to look ashamed. "That was Jessica's idea. She said it was just a precaution in case decisions needed to be made while you were recovering. Yet you used it to transfer my house and drain my accounts." "The accounts?" He hesitated, glancing at his attorney, who nodded slightly. "That was all Jessica and Howard. They told me they were moving some funds to safer investments for your retirement. I didn't know they were actually stealing." I studied his face, searching for the truth in his eyes. There was desperation there, certainly, fear. But was there genuine remorse, or merely regret at being caught? "And the house?" I pressed. "You personally told me I couldn't come home. You stood in the doorway of the house your father and I built and told me it wasn't mine anymore." His eyes dropped to the table. "Jessica convinced me it was for the best. She said the house was too much for you to manage, that you'd be happier in a senior community. I thought," he swallowed hard, "I thought we were helping you. By throwing me out with nothing but the clothes on my back? By packing my personal belongings in boxes in the garage?" The calm I'd maintained began to crack. "That's not help, Stephen. That's cruelty." "I know," he whispered. "I know that now. What did they have on you?" I asked suddenly, the question that had been nagging at me for days. "Jessica and her parents, what hold did they have that would make you betray your own mother this way?" Stephen's head snapped up, surprise evident in his expression. His attorney shifted uncomfortably. "Mrs. Wilson," Reed interjected, "we should focus on—" "No," Stephen interrupted. "She deserves to know." He took a deep breath. "3 years ago, I made some bad investments, lost a lot of money, our savings, part of our retirement fund. I was desperate to recover it before Jessica found out. Howard offered to help, said he had foolproof investment opportunities. He loaned you money, I guessed." Stephen nodded miserably. "At first, then it became more complicated. I signed documents, became part of their business ventures without fully understanding what they were. By the time I realized what was happening, I was already implicated in several of their schemes. They had leverage over you," Diane observed. "They owned me," Stephen corrected bitterly. "Jessica made it clear that if I didn't cooperate with their plans, her father would make sure I took the fall for everything. I absorbed this new information, trying to reconcile it with the son I thought I knew. And my house? My accounts? A test of loyalty," he admitted, shame evident in his slumped shoulders, "to prove I was committed to their operation. Jessica said once the neighborhood properties were rezoned, we'd make enough money to set you up comfortably somewhere else. You believe that?" I couldn't keep the incredulity from my voice. "I wanted to believe it," he replied softly. It was easier than admitting what I was really doing. The raw honesty of the statement struck me. For the first time since this nightmare began, I glimpsed the son I remembered, the boy who, when caught in a lie, would eventually admit the truth, however painful. "Stephen," I said carefully, "what exactly are you asking of me today?" He met my eyes directly for the first time. "Nothing, Mom. I don't deserve your help or forgiveness. His voice broke slightly. "I needed you to know that I never wanted to hurt you. I was weak and scared and made terrible choices. Whatever happens now, I'll accept it." The simple dignity of his response, so at odds with the desperate excuses I'd expected, caught me off guard. Before I could formulate a reply, a knock at the door interrupted us. Agent Reeves entered, nodding apologetically. "Sorry to interrupt, but we have an urgent development. Mrs. Wilson, could you step outside for a moment?" In a sterile federal building interview room, I finally faced my son, searching for answers to the betrayal that shattered our family. Instead of the excuses I expected, Stephen reveals a more complex truth. He became entangled in the Thompson schemes years earlier through financial desperation, eventually becoming their pawn through blackmail and manipulation. While his explanation doesn't justify his actions, his admission that the house transfer was a test of loyalty engineered by Jessica offers the first glimpse of the son I thought I knew. Just as this painful revelation begins to shift my understanding, Agent Reeves interrupts with urgent news, suggesting yet another twist in this increasingly complicated case. Despite everything, I find myself wondering if there might be a path forward from this devastation, not back to what was, but towards something new, built on painful truth rather than comfortable illusions. Agent Reeves guided me to a small conference room down the hall, Diane following closely behind. The agent's usual composed demeanor seemed slightly rattled, which immediately put me on alert. "What's happened?" I asked as the door closed behind us. "We've been executing additional search warrants related to the Thompsons' business records," Reeves explained, placing a file folder on the table. "A team in Seattle discovered something you need to see." She opened the folder and extracted several photographs, laying them carefully in front of me. I leaned forward, studying the images with growing confusion. They showed a private hospital room, medical equipment, and a patient in a bed. "I don't understand," I said, looking up at Reeves. "What does this have to do with—" The words died in my throat as I looked more closely at the final photograph. The patient was me, unconscious, connected to monitors, clearly in the ICU during my recent hospitalization. "These were found in a hidden safe in Howard Thompson's Seattle office," Reeves explained quietly. "Along with these." She placed another set of documents on the table. Medical charts, doctor's notes, medication orders. My medical records, which should have been securely protected at Portland Memorial Hospital. "How did they get these?" Diane asked, her legal mind immediately grasping the implications. "That's what concerned us," Reeves replied. "The timestamps on these photos don't align with regular visiting hours, and these medical records contain information that family members wouldn't typically have access to." A chill ran through me as I processed what she was suggesting. Someone inside the hospital was working with them. Reeves nodded grimly. We've identified a nurse who accessed your records repeatedly during times when neither Stephen nor Jessica was present. Phone records show multiple calls between this individual and Howard Thompson. But why? I asked, struggling to understand. Why monitor me so closely? Diane's face had gone pale as she examined the documents. Martha, look at these medication records. I followed her finger to a notation on one of the charts. A dosage adjustment for my post-surgical pain management. The original prescription had been crossed out, replaced with a higher dose in different handwriting. Your recovery took longer than expected, Reeves said carefully. The infection that kept you hospitalized for 21 days instead of the typical 5 to 7. We're investigating whether it may have been deliberately complicated. The implication hit me with physical force. Are you saying they tried to... I couldn't finish the sentence. We're not making any allegations yet, Reeves clarified quickly. But we're investigating the possibility that someone attempted to extend your hospitalization to provide more time for the Thompsons to execute their plans. I gripped the edge of the table, suddenly lightheaded. The thought that someone might have deliberately interfered with my medical care, potentially putting my life at risk, was almost too horrifying to comprehend. Does Stephen know about this? I managed to ask. Not yet, Reeves replied. We wanted to inform you first, given the personal nature of this discovery. Diane placed her hand over mine, her expression grave. Martha, if someone deliberately compromised your care, that elevates this case significantly. We're no longer talking about fraud and elder abuse, but potentially attempted... I know, I interrupted, unable to hear the words spoken aloud. The possibility was too monstrous to face directly. There's one more thing, Reeves continued reluctantly. We found a life insurance policy taken out on you 6 months ago. The beneficiary is listed as Stephen Wilson. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Stephen knew, I whispered, the last fragments of hope for my son crumbling away. He had to know. Not necessarily, Reeves cautioned. The policy application bears his signature, but we've already identified several forged documents in this case. We'll need to investigate further before drawing conclusions. I closed my eyes, trying to steady myself against this new wave of betrayal. If Stephen had known about these machinations, if he had been complicit in potentially threatening my life, then everything he'd just told me in the interview room was a lie. The glimpse of my real son I thought I'd seen was nothing but another manipulation. I need to see him again, I said, opening my eyes with newfound resolve. Right now. Mrs. Wilson, given this new information, we strongly advise against... Reeves began. I need to see his face when he learns about this, I insisted. I'll know whether he knew. After 21 years as a compliance officer and a lifetime as a mother, I had developed an almost preternatural ability to detect deception. I needed to look into Stephen's eyes when this bombshell dropped. Reeves hesitated, then nodded. We were planning to question him about these discoveries anyway. If you insist on being present, we can arrange it. When we returned to the interview room, Stephen and his attorney were in hushed conversation. They fell silent as we entered, both looking up expectantly. Mr. Wilson, Reeves began formally, we've discovered evidence that requires immediate explanation. She laid out the photographs and medical records on the table. Stephen's expression shifted from confusion to shock to horror as he processed what he was seeing. What is this? He whispered, looking up at me with wide eyes. Mom, what is this? Photos of me in the ICU, I replied, watching his face intently. Medical records that should have been private. Evidence suggesting someone may have deliberately extended my hospitalization. That's not possible, he stammered, genuinely horrified if my instincts were correct. I would never... And a life insurance policy, Reeves continued relentlessly, taken out on your mother 6 months ago, with you listed as the beneficiary. Stephen's face drained of all color. I never took out any life insurance policy on my mother. Never. His attorney leaned forward, instantly alert. Agent Reeves, my client has been cooperating fully. If you're suggesting he was involved in some kind of... I'm not suggesting anything yet, Reeves interrupted. I'm asking for an explanation of these documents. I can't explain them because I had nothing to do with them. Stephen's voice rose in panic. Jessica handled all our insurance matters. She said we were updating our own policies. I signed whatever she put in front of me. The raw fear in his eyes, not just fear of consequences, but genuine horror at what had been done, told me more than any words could. My son had been weak, foolish, and morally compromised. but I didn't believe he had knowingly participated in a plot that might have endangered my life. "Do you realize what this means, Stephen?" I asked quietly. "Your wife and her parents may have been planning something far worse than stealing my house." He covered his face with his hands, his shoulders beginning to shake. "Oh God," he whispered. "What have I done? What have I allowed to happen?" As I watched my son confront the true depths of his wife's betrayal, I felt an unexpected wave of pity. Stephen had made terrible choices, had betrayed me in ways that might be unforgivable, but he was also a victim of the Thompsons' manipulation, a pawn in a game far darker than even he had realized. "I need to amend my statement," Stephen said suddenly, looking up at Reeves with newfound determination. "I need to tell you everything I know about Jessica and her parents. Everything. A devastating revelation shatters what little remained of my world. Evidence suggesting the Thompsons may have deliberately complicated my medical recovery, possibly even putting my life at risk. Most shocking of all is the discovery of a life insurance policy on me, with Stephen as beneficiary. When confronted with this evidence, my son's genuine horror and shock tell me what I desperately need to know. While he betrayed me terribly, he wasn't complicit in this most monstrous aspect of their scheme. As Stephen faces the true nature of his wife's actions, his determination to reveal everything suggests there are even darker secrets yet to be uncovered. Despite my lingering anger, I find myself wondering if somewhere in this nightmare, there might be the first fragile seeds of redemption. Not forgiveness yet, but perhaps understanding. 17 properties. Agent Callahan spread a map across the conference room table. All acquired through the same fraudulent methods, all funneled through shell companies connected to the Thompsons. 2 weeks had passed since the bombshell revelations about my medical records. I'd been moved to a secure apartment provided by the FBI, my whereabouts known only to Diane and the agents directly involved in the case. The investigation had expanded dramatically, revealing a criminal enterprise far more extensive than initially suspected. "And the nurse?" I asked, the question that had haunted me since learning someone may have deliberately complicated my recovery. "Miranda Jenkins," Reeves replied, sliding a personnel file toward me. "She worked in the post-surgical ward for 3 years. We've confirmed she received multiple payments from a Thompson shell company, totaling over $25,000 in the past 6 months. Has she confessed to tampering with my medication?" I needed to know the full truth, however painful. Callahan and Reeves exchanged glances. "She's cooperating," Callahan said carefully. According to her statement, she was instructed to ensure an extended recovery period by adjusting certain medications and introducing a mild bacterial contaminant during IV changes. My stomach turned at the clinical description of what amounted to calculated harm. She could have killed me. She claims she calibrated the contamination to cause extended hospitalization without life-threatening complications, Reeves added, disgust evident in her tone. As if that somehow mitigates what she did. And Jessica? She arranged this? The question felt almost rhetorical. I already knew the answer. Howard Thompson made the initial contact with Jenkins, Callahan confirmed. But yes, the evidence suggests Jessica orchestrated the specifics. Text messages recovered from her phone include detailed questions about your treatment schedule, medication regimen, and expected discharge dates. I closed my eyes briefly, still struggling to process the calculated cruelty of it all. My own daughter-in-law had deliberately extended my suffering to buy time for their scheme. "What about Stephen's involvement?" Diane asked, voicing the question I couldn't bring myself to ask. "We found no evidence he was aware of the medical tampering," Reeves said. "His cooperation has been extensive, and we believe genuine. The prosecutor is considering his testimony crucial to building the case against the Thompsons." A small mercy, then. My son had betrayed me, but he hadn't conspired to harm me physically. The distinction felt important, though it didn't erase the pain of his actions. "There's something else you should see," Callahan said, sliding a file folder toward me. This was recovered from Jessica's private email account. Inside was a series of emails between Jessica and her parents, dating back nearly 2 years. They outlined a methodical plan to gain control of my assets, first by isolating me from other family and friends, then by gradually taking over my financial affairs, and finally by transitioning me to long-term care once they had secured legal control of everything. The cold-blooded plotting made my hands shake as I read. They had targeted me long before my hip surgery became necessary, viewing my eventual physical decline as an opportunity to exploit. My hospitalization had simply accelerated their timeline. And this, Callahan continued, is perhaps most disturbing of all. He placed a printed real estate listing before me, a luxury senior living facility in Arizona. Attached was an email from Jessica to her parents. Perfect location for Martha once everything's finalized. Isolated, minimal oversight, and their memory care unit accepts patients without extensive medical documentation. Once she's there, we'll have complete control over all communication and visitors. They had planned to institutionalize me, to effectively imprison me in a facility far from anyone who knew me, where I could be conveniently forgotten while they enjoyed the fruits of their theft. There will be additional charges based on this evidence, Reeves explained. Elder abuse, conspiracy, possibly attempted murder depending on how the DA views the medical tampering. I nodded, too overwhelmed to speak immediately. The scope of what had been planned for me, the calculated destruction of not just my financial security, but my freedom and dignity, was almost too much to comprehend. When can I go home? I finally asked, the question that had been foremost in my mind for weeks now. The forensic team completed their work at your residence yesterday, Callahan replied. Technically, you could return now, though we recommend waiting until we've confirmed there are no security concerns. I want to go today, I said firmly. I need to be in my own space again. Diane squeezed my hand supportively. I'll stay with you for the first few days. We can have additional security installed if needed. Reeves nodded. We can arrange that. There's one more matter to discuss, though. She hesitated slightly. Stephen has requested another meeting with you. He's being transferred to a minimum security facility pending trial, and he's asked to speak with you before that happens. My immediate instinct was to refuse. The wound of his betrayal remained raw, and I wasn't sure I had the emotional strength for another confrontation. Yet something in me, perhaps the mother who remembered the child he had once been, couldn't deny this request. When? I asked simply. Tomorrow morning, if that works for you, Reeves replied. After that, he'll have limited visitor access until the legal proceedings are complete. I nodded slowly. I'll see him. Later that afternoon, I stood on the porch of my home, key in hand, hesitating before inserting it into the lock. The house looked the same externally, but I knew that inside, strangers had violated my personal space, had plotted my demise within walls that should have represented safety. Take your time, Diane said gently beside me. This is bound to be difficult. I drew a deep breath and unlocked the door. The familiar scent of my home, wood polish, old books, the faint lavender from sachets I placed in closets, had been overlaid with unfamiliar perfumes and cleaning products. Evidence of the Thompsons' brief occupation was visible in subtle ways. Furniture slightly rearranged, my prized orchid collection removed from the sunroom, new curtains hanging in the living room. In my study, William's antique desk had been repositioned to face the door rather than the window where he had always preferred it, to enjoy the garden view while working. The personal affront of this small change hit me harder than I expected. They had erased our preferences, our history, without a second thought. We can put everything back the way it was, Diane assured me, seeing my expression. Make it yours again. I nodded, moving through the room slowly, cataloging changes and violations. In the master bedroom, my clothes had been removed from the closet, replaced with Jessica's expensive designer collection. My simple jewelry box had been emptied, the pieces William had given me over our years together, nowhere to be seen. The FBI recovered most of your jewelry from the Thompson safe deposit box, Reeves had told me earlier. It will be returned once it's processed as evidence. Small comfort, knowing strangers had handled those intimate tokens of my marriage, had assessed their monetary, rather than sentimental value. In the kitchen, my collection of handwritten recipe cards, including my mother's and grandmother's irreplaceable originals, had been discarded, replaced with sleek modern cookbooks that had clearly never been used. The slight felt personal, an erasure of family history that struck deeper than the financial theft. As I completed my survey of the damage, a strange calm settled over me. This house, these possessions, had been violated, but they were still mine. I had survived, had fought back, had reclaimed what was taken. The Thompson family had underestimated my resilience, my resources, and my resolve. I'll stay, I decided, turning to Diane. Tonight, in my home. Are you sure? She asked, concerned. We could start fresh tomorrow. I'm sure, I replied, newfound strength in my voice. They don't get to keep me away from my own home one night longer. As evening fell, I sat on my back porch with a cup of tea, watching twilight settle over the garden William and I had planted together decades ago. The roses needed pruning, the hydrangeas had been neglected, but the bones of our shared creation remained. Tomorrow would bring another difficult conversation with Stephen, more legal proceedings, the long process of restoring my home and my life. But tonight, I had reclaimed my space. It was a beginning. As the investigation deepens, I'm confronted with the horrifying truth. Jessica and her parents had orchestrated a scheme far more sinister than mere theft. Evidence reveals they deliberately complicated my medical recovery through a corrupt nurse, planned to institutionalize me in an isolated facility, and had been targeting me for nearly 2 years. While Stephen appears innocent of the most disturbing aspects of their plot, the calculated cruelty of what was intended for me is almost too monstrous to comprehend. Standing in my violated home, seeing how they erased evidence of my life and marriage, I faced the long road of reclaiming not just my property, but my sense of safety. Tomorrow brings another confrontation with my son before he's transferred to a facility awaiting trial. A conversation I dread but cannot avoid if I'm ever to understand how our family unraveled so completely. The detention center's visitor room was brighter than I expected, fluorescent lights reflecting off pale yellow walls in a misguided attempt at cheerfulness. Stephen sat at a small table, dressed in a standard-issue jumpsuit that hung loosely on his frame. He'd lost weight in the weeks since his arrest, his face gaunt, eyes shadowed by sleepless nights. "Thank you for coming," he said as I took the seat across from him. No attorney present this time. His choice, I'd been told. "You wanted to see me," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "I'm here." He nodded, eyes dropping to his hands, which were clasped tightly on the table. "They told me about the nurse, about what Jessica and her parents planned for you." "Yes." I offered nothing more, waiting. "I swear to you, Mom, I didn't know." His voice cracked slightly. "I knew they wanted your house, your money. That was bad enough, unforgivable, but I never imagined they would." He trailed off, unable to articulate the full horror of what had been planned. "I believe you," I said simply. His head snapped up, surprise evident in his expression. "You do? About that specific part?" "Yes. I've seen enough evidence to believe you weren't aware of their plans to harm me physically or institutionalize me." I kept my tone measured, factual. "But you were aware of their plans to take everything I owned. You participated willingly in that theft." He flinched but didn't deny it. "Yes. Why, Stephen?" The question that had haunted me for weeks finally emerged. "You grew up with every advantage. Your father and I taught you about integrity, about respecting others. What happened to that boy?" Stephen was silent for a long moment, seemingly gathering courage for what he needed to say. "I've asked myself that same question every night in my cell," he finally replied. "The easy answer is that I was weak, afraid of losing Jessica if I didn't go along with what she wanted, afraid of the financial consequences if her father exposed my involvement in their earlier schemes. And the hard answer?" I pressed. "The hard answer," he said, meeting my eyes directly, "is that somewhere along the way, I started believing I deserved more than I had earned, that taking shortcuts was justified if it got me what I wanted." His voice was barely above a whisper now. "I became someone I don't recognize, someone Dad would have been ashamed of." The mention of William, who had been so proud of our son, who had such high hopes for the man he would become, brought a sharp pain to my chest. "Your father would indeed be disappointed," I acknowledged. "As am I. But I think what would disappoint him most is not that you made mistakes, but that you betrayed your own principles to cover those mistakes." Stephen nodded, accepting this truth without defense. "The prosecutors have offered a plea deal, 5 years, reduced to 3 with good behavior in exchange for my complete testimony against Jessica and her parents. Are you going to take it?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. "It's more mercy than I deserve." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of consequences hanging heavy between us. My son would spend years in prison. The life he had known was gone forever. The bright future William and I had envisioned for him had dissolved into this sterile visitor room with its unforgiving fluorescent lights. "I found something in the house yesterday," I said, changing direction. In the back of your father's desk drawer. I reached into my purse and removed a small, worn envelope. It's a letter he wrote to you before he died. He asked me to give it to you when I thought you needed it most. I think that time is now. Stephen's hand trembled slightly as he took the envelope, turning it over to see his name in William's distinctive handwriting. I didn't know this existed, he whispered. He wrote several letters during his final months. This was the last one. I watched as he carefully opened it, handling the paper as if it might disintegrate at his touch. I remained silent as he read, watching emotions play across his face. Grief, shame, and finally, something like resolve. When he finished, he folded the letter carefully and pressed it to his chest for a moment before returning it to the envelope. "Thank you for bringing this," he said, his voice steadier now. I needed to hear his voice again. "Even if the circumstances are—" He gestured vaguely at our surroundings. "What will you do after?" I asked. "When you've served your time?" The question seemed to surprise him. Perhaps he hadn't allowed himself to think that far ahead, or perhaps he hadn't expected me to acknowledge a future for him beyond punishment. "I don't know," he admitted. "My career in finance is over, obviously. My reputation." He shrugged, the gesture eloquently conveying the destruction of his former life. "You'll need to rebuild," I said. "Not just practically, but morally. That's the harder work." "I know." He hesitated, then asked the question that clearly weighed on him most heavily. "Will you ever be able to forgive me, Mom?" I considered my answer carefully, unwilling to offer easy platitudes or false promises. Forgiveness isn't a single moment, Stephen. It's a process. Right now, I'm still processing the hurt, the betrayal, the shock of discovering who you allowed yourself to become. I met his gaze directly. "I don't know if complete forgiveness is possible, but I do know this. You are still my son. Nothing changes that biological fact. What our relationship looks like moving forward will depend on the choices you make from this point on." He nodded, accepting this partial answer with surprising grace. "That's fair. More than fair." Our time was nearly up. A guard hovered nearby, ready to escort Stephen back to his cell. As we stood to say goodbye, he asked one final question. "The house? Will you stay there? After everything that happened?" "Yes," I said with certainty. "It's my home. I won't let what they did chase me away from the life your father and I built." "Good," he said softly. "Dad would want that." As I watched him being led away, shoulders straight despite the circumstances, I felt an unexpected sense of closure. Not healing, that would take much longer, but the beginning of understanding. My son had made terrible choices, had betrayed me in ways that might never be fully repaired. But beneath the man who had participated in the Thompsons' scheme, fragments of the child I'd raised still existed. Outside the detention center, Diane waited in her car, a silent support I had come to rely on during these difficult weeks. "How did it go?" she asked as I settled into the passenger seat. "As well as could be expected," I replied, gazing out at the autumn leaves swirling across the parking lot. "He's taking a plea deal. 5 years, potentially reduced to 3. And how do you feel about that?" I considered the question, allowing myself to fully examine my emotional response. Sad, relieved, angry still, but less so. Mostly I feel clear about what happened, about where we go from here. Diane nodded, understanding without needing further explanation. As we drove back toward my home, my true home, reclaimed and being slowly restored, I reflected on the journey of the past months, from the shock of betrayal to the fight for justice, from the horror of discovering what had been planned for me to this moment of fragile resolution. The road ahead remained complex. The legal proceedings against Jessica and her parents would continue for months. The process of fully securing my assets and rebuilding my life would take time. The relationship with my son, if it could be salvaged at all, would require years of careful reconstruction. But for the first time since awakening from surgery to discover my world had been shattered, I felt genuinely hopeful about the future. Not because the path would be easy, but because I had discovered strengths within myself I hadn't known existed. As we turned onto my street, the late afternoon sun illuminated my house, my home, with golden light that seemed to promise new beginnings amidst the endings. In the harsh fluorescent light of a detention center visitor room, I finally hear the truth from my son. His admission of moral failure, his recognition of how far he strayed from the values his father and I taught him. While he appears genuinely horrified by the physical harm Jessica and her parents planned for me, He accepts full responsibility for his role in stealing my property and assets. As he faces a plea deal that will send him to prison for years, I give him one last gift from his father, a letter William wrote before his death, saved for when Stephen would need it most. His question about forgiveness has no simple answer. I can only offer honesty about the long, uncertain road ahead. Leaving the detention center, I feel an unexpected clarity, not healing yet, but the first step toward whatever new reality awaits us both. With my home being restored and justice in process, I find myself looking forward rather than back, discovering strength I never knew I possessed. "That's the last of it," Diane declared, setting down a framed family photograph on my newly restored bookshelf. 6 months had passed since my confrontation with Stephen at the detention center. 6 months of patient reconstruction, of my home, my finances, and my sense of security. "It looks right again," I observed, glancing around my living room. The furniture had been returned to its proper positions, the curtains replaced with my preferred styles, the subtle marks of the Thompsons' brief occupation systematically erased. "Better than right," Diane countered, gesturing toward the new security system panel by the door. "It's safer now than it ever was." She had a point. The ordeal had led to practical improvements, upgraded locks, a comprehensive security system, new protocols for my financial accounts. The vulnerability that had allowed the Thompsons to infiltrate my life had been identified and fortified against future threats. "The roses are coming back nicely too," I added, glancing through the window at my garden, where spring blossoms had begun to emerge. I'd spent hours replanting and tending the beds that had been neglected during the Thompsons' occupation, finding unexpected therapy and reconnecting with the earth. Diane smiled, recognizing the metaphor in my statement. "Yes, they are. Given proper care and time, remarkable recovery is possible." The past months had brought significant developments. Jessica and her parents had faced a cascade of federal charges: fraud, conspiracy, elder abuse, and attempted murder for the medical tampering. The evidence against them, bolstered by Stephen's comprehensive testimony, had been overwhelming. Rather than face a trial with its inevitable lengthy sentences, they had accepted plea agreements: 20 years for Howard, 15 for Patricia, 18 for Jessica. The scope of their criminal enterprise had proven even larger than initially suspected, with victims identified across 3 states. The nurse who had tampered with my medication had received 8 years, her sentence reduced in exchange for testimony about other vulnerable patients the Thompsons had targeted. The investigation had uncovered 2 previous cases where elderly homeowners had died under suspicious circumstances after becoming involved with Thompson investment properties, cases now being reinvestigated as potential homicides. My neighborhood had been spared the predatory rezoning scheme. With the Thompsons' operation exposed, the properties they had acquired were being returned to their rightful owners or their estates. The community had rallied together, establishing a support network for elderly residents to protect against similar schemes in the future. "Have you decided about the visit yet?" Diane asked, breaking into my thoughts as she poured us both glasses of iced tea. The visit she referred to was Stephen's latest request. Now 3 months into his sentence at a minimum security facility, he had asked if I would consider seeing him again. His letters, sent weekly since his incarceration began, had been respectful of my boundaries, never presuming forgiveness, but consistently expressing remorse and detailing his efforts toward rehabilitation. "I think I'll go," I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. "Not next week. I have the garden club fundraiser, but perhaps the week after." Diane nodded, her expression carefully neutral. "You seem more at peace with the idea than you were a month ago." "I had a dream about William last night," I explained, the memory bringing unexpected comfort. "We were sitting on the porch swing, just talking as we used to. He said something that stayed with me. Healing isn't about erasing the wound, Martha. It's about finding purpose in the scar." "That sounds like William," Diane observed with a gentle smile. "Always finding wisdom in difficulty." "I woke up thinking about Stephen," I continued, "about how some wounds can't be fully healed, but perhaps they can still lead somewhere meaningful. Not back to what was, but forward to something new." The doorbell interrupted our conversation. Through the security camera feed displayed on my new tablet, I saw a delivery person holding a large floral arrangement. "Are you expecting flowers?" Diane asked, moving toward the door. "No," I replied, suddenly wary. Old anxieties died hard, despite the security measures now in place. Diane checked the delivery person's credentials before accepting the arrangement. A beautiful bouquet of lilies and irises, my favorites. The card read simply, "Thinking of you on your birthday. Your neighbor, Eleanor." I smiled, touched by the thoughtfulness. Eleanor Jameson had moved into the house across the street 3 months ago, a retired literature professor with a quick wit and common interests. We had gradually developed a friendship over shared gardening tips and book recommendations. She had lost her husband around the same time as I'd lost William, creating an immediate bond of understanding between us. "That was kind of her," Diane remarked, admiring the arrangement. "You're building quite a community here." She was right. In the aftermath of the Thompson scheme, I had made a conscious decision to strengthen my connections rather than retreat into isolation. The neighborhood book club I'd started now met monthly in my living room. The local senior center where I volunteered twice weekly had become a source of meaningful friendships. The garden club had welcomed my expertise on heritage roses, appointing me chair of their annual exhibition. These connections, genuine, supportive, freely chosen, had become my strongest protection against future vulnerability. "I've been thinking about the foundation," I said, changing subjects as we settled onto the porch swing with our tea. "William's Medical Research Foundation," I clarified, referring to the organization my husband had established before his death to fund research into the rare heart condition that had eventually taken his life. "What about it?" Diane asked. "I'd like to expand its mission," I explained. "Add a division focused specifically on elder protection, legal advocacy, fraud prevention education, support services for victims." Diane's eyes lit up with interest. "Using your experience to help others in similar situations." "Exactly. The Thompsons had dozens of victims before they targeted me. Most didn't have my resources or knowledge to fight back. I want to change that equation for others." "It's a wonderful idea," Diane said warmly. "William would be proud." "I think so too," I agreed, gazing out at the neighborhood where I'd rebuilt my sense of home and safety, finding purpose in the scar, as he would say. As afternoon faded toward evening, we sat in comfortable silence, watching neighbors return from work, children play on nearby lawns, the rhythms of community continuing around us. The trauma of what had happened would never completely disappear. There would always be moments of heightened vigilance, echoes of betrayal that resurfaced unexpectedly. But those scars no longer defined my daily existence. They had become instead a source of wisdom, of deepened empathy, of renewed purpose. Later, after Diane had departed, I sat at William's desk, now restored to its proper position facing the garden window, and began drafting the framework for the foundation's new division. As I worked, I felt a sense of rightness, of coming full circle. The Thompsons had targeted me because they saw an elderly widow as inherently vulnerable, easily victimized. The foundation would transform that painful experience into protection for countless others. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, a meeting with the foundation board, preparations for my eventual visit to Stephen, ongoing restoration of the garden that had suffered during my absence. But for the first time in many months, I looked forward to those challenges with genuine enthusiasm rather than mere determination. The phone rang, interrupting my work. Eleanor from across the street, calling to ensure the flowers had been delivered properly and to invite me to a chamber music concert the following weekend. As we chatted, I realized how profoundly my life had changed in the 6 months since reclaiming my home. The betrayal had broken something essential, my basic trust in family, in the inherent protection of familiar spaces. But from that breaking had emerged new strengths, new connections, new purpose that might never have developed otherwise. Finding purpose in the scar, I murmured to myself after hanging up, William's wisdom echoing in my mind. Not erasing the wound, but allowing it to transform into something meaningful, something that might, in time, become its own kind of beauty. 6 months after confronting Stephen, I find myself in a season of unexpected renewal. As my home is restored and my garden begins to bloom again, I receive news that Jessica and her parents have accepted lengthy prison sentences. Their extensive criminal enterprise finally stopped. The neighborhood they targeted has banded together in mutual protection, while I've built new friendships and community connections that enrich my daily life. When Stephen requests another visit at his minimum security facility, I decide, inspired by a dream of William, that I'm ready to take this step, not toward erasing what happened, but toward finding purpose in the painful experience. This purpose takes concrete form in my plan to expand Williams Foundation to include elder protection services, transforming my personal trauma into a shield for others who might be targeted. As I settle into this new chapter, I realize that while the betrayal broke something essential within me, the breaking itself created space for unexpected growth, new connections, and a deeper wisdom about what truly matters in the time I have left.